Place your advance order now on Amazon for the very first volume of the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series, Is There Life After Death? Publication date is June 1st.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today I am very pleased to bring to the new Thinking Aloud audience another conversation with my good friend James Tunney, based in Gothenburg, Sweden. James is an attorney, he is a poet, he is a painter, and a scholar. He is author of many books, including 2 dystopian novels, Blue Lies September and Ireland, I Don't Recognize Who She Is. In addition, he has written The Mystical Accord, Sutras to Suit Our Times, Lines for Spiritual Evolution, The Mystery of the Trapped Light, Mystical Thoughts in the Dark Age of Scientism, Empire of Scientism, The Dispiriting Conspiracy and Inevitable Tyranny of Scientocracy, Tech Bondage, Slavery of the Human Spirit, Human Entrance to Transhumanism, Machine Merger and the End of Humanity, and most recently, Plantation of the Automatons. Today, we will be exploring the life and work of the great film director, writer, and actor Orson Welles. As I've mentioned, James is in Sweden, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, James. It's a great pleasure to be with you once again. This, I think, is our 41st video conversation.
Looking forward to the conversation, Jeffrey.
We'll be talking about Orson Welles, who is regarded by many people as one of the greatest filmmakers ever, a genius. His film Citizen Kane is still regarded by many as, even though it was made as early as 1941, when he was, I think, 25 years old, the greatest film ever made. And the irony is that many young people today who aren't as old as you and I may never have heard of him, don't know who he is at all.
That's right. And for me, Orson Welles is one of the great artists of the 20th century. So he is respected by people who love cinema, and he is regarded, as you said, as one of the great directors of all time. But he's also been a great actor, and his work in the theatre was very significant, and also he was very important as a social commentator. He was a journalist as well, and he wrote articles. And even the people who knew him in his popular work through television series are not so interested in some of the great films that the cinema goers love. But he did become even a figure to be joked at, like other comedians like John Candy used to make fun of Orson Welles, and Robbie Coltrane, I think, in Britain. So he was regarded as a figure of fun because of his size later on. And there was an element of a simplification that people began to believe in the image as a kind of reductive view of him, and they failed to see that this man's life represented a kind of great symphony, a great fugue with different themes, of which the cinema was a central aspect, but not the only aspect. And there's many adults as well that have not looked, because of the popular conception of him, at his great role and the great themes outside his innovations in relation to radio and theatre and film.
His first movie, Citizen Kane, was first shown at the Academy Awards. It didn't win the award for greatest picture. It was actually booed when it was presented. And I gather the reason is that it was basically a very harsh critique of one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in America, William Randolph Hearst, at the time. And Hearst went to great lengths to try to suppress the movie. And in fact, I think one way of looking at Wells' career is that he always was a fighter against the follies and dangers of the establishment.
Yes, the film did win Best Screenplay, and for a number of different reasons, it didn't win awards. But I mean, they're disregarded in the historical analysis of the power of the film, and the film was set in a context of a historic struggle between the Rockefellers and William Randolph Hearst, and this film does attack a figure which is very similar to William Randolph Hearst, and that was actually preempted by a book by Aldous Huxley, 1939, which was on that subject. And then when Wells had come to Hollywood, there was a few possibilities in relation to making films because he had achieved great success before then, and this theme worked for him because he was always interested in huge, powerful figures, in dark figures, in Faustian figures, and in attacking William Randolph Hearst, he's attacking a system. He's attacking a media system that's associated with international war and the inculcation and fomentation of war as well. So there's a bit of irony in the sense that the Rockefellers were behind the scenes to some extent in their support of RKO, where the film came from, but they weren't exercising influence on the particular topic. Wells was always criticizing the abuse of power and criticizing the psychological accumulation of power and criticizing trusts and corporate control. And that was a theme that he pursued throughout his life in attacking the assembly line production of cinema and in attacking just what corporations can do. The film was eventually loved by a range of people who understood that this was a great innovation in cinema. In particular, I think the use of Greg Toland or the opportunity of the great cinematographer Greg Toland was very important. He was a fantastic, one of my favorite cinematographers who had worked on Wuthering Heights, and he was an expert in creating moods with the camera and in creating an atmosphere and a sense of using the device of pathetic fallacy, of having nature express moods and emotions, and with a depth in the camera work that's hard to get in other ways. And he had approached Orson Welles. This was an element of Welles' story, a kind of synchronicity, a kind of luck that happened throughout his lifetime. And the reason why apparently he approached Welles was he believed that Welles would have such an originality and a lack of knowledge of how the medium worked that he'd be able to innovate. And he knew from the work that Welles had pursued, particularly in New York, through the Federal Theatre project and on the stage, and his long history at that stage on the stage, that he would be able to add something to this context. But there are deeper themes in all his movies.
It's interesting that you talk about his long history since he was 25 years old at the time of making Citizen Kane. But even before that, he was regarded as a great genius. I believe he co-founded with John Houseman the Mercury Theater of the Air, a radio theater program. I think goes back to 1938. He would have been about 23 years old at that time, with the full backing of CBS. And one of the productions of that radio theater, for which he's still famous, of course, is his production of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds.
Yes, he's in the Mercury Theatre, which is on the stage, but it's also on radio. And in 1938 is the famous War of the Worlds broadcast, whereby people believed, or some people believe that there was actually a Martian landing on the Earth, an attack on the Earth, but they had used H.G. Wells' story from War of the Worlds. But what's interesting is that he was known before then, and a lot of people think that it was only because of that he became famous, but he was on the cover of Time magazine before then because of his work with the Mercury Theatre. And the Mercury Theatre came about around 1937 with John Houseman, as you said, who later appeared in films like The Paper Chase, which many law students will have looked at. And this came after the Federal Theatre Project. And in the Federal Theatre Project, he had, as a young man, he's 20 when he's directing a play, and one particular play that he directs is the Voodoo Macbeth, as it's called, whereby he takes Shakespeare, who is a great love of his, and he transforms it into a Haitian context and uses a totally African-American cast, and it toured the country for a while. It was a great success. There was thousands of people came to see it. And this showed that he was a great innovator. But his career had started long before that. There is some dispute when it started, for there is some arguments that he was actually on the stage as a 3-year-old in an opera. And although there's some suggestions that he was even too heavy for the soprano at that stage. But he's from Kenosha in Wisconsin, and kind of in your kind of area, and he eventually goes to Illinois, to Woodstock, to a school, Todd School, and this was seen to be kind of innovative, and it was innovative. It was very innovative. So he's there when he's 11, and at that stage he's producing plays already. So and he begins to write plays, and he begins to write a play called Bright Lucifer, exploring the Luciferian connection, another element that links us with Steiner perhaps. And he puts on and explores the medium. They have also radio equipment there in Woodstock, Illinois, and Woodstock, Illinois was in the film Groundhog Day. It's not far over the border from Wisconsin, and he regarded Woodstock as his home in many senses, because his mother died and his father died a few years later, and he spent quite a bit of time in Woodstock, and he was successful, launched his theatre career. And it's quite amazing that when he's 16, he travels to Ireland. And he starts his public performances there, apart from school plays, in Ireland, age 16.
I gather he made lifelong friends there in Ireland, so obviously, with your Irish background, that makes him a special figure.
Well, yes, I at one stage I was very interested in film, Jeff, and I wrote a few articles, academic articles about film, and I had talks with people. I was interested in film production, and I was really going to concentrate at one stage, and I loved the medium. I lost interest in the last few years, or I changed direction, but I was very interested. And I was very interested in Orson Welles coming to Ireland age 16. So he arrives on a boat to Galway. He's kind of, in my head, he's always living a kind of artistic persona, because he believes there's a reflexive relationship between art and life. And in my head, he's a kind of Yankee Doodle dandy going to on the way to London, because he does go on to London for a short time before he goes back to America. And he arrives on this boat, age 16, the west of Ireland, on a painting holiday, which is quite remarkable, on his own. And he's going to travel around the west of Ireland. And the song Yankee Doodle Dandy is supposedly based on a tune about on the way to Galway, according to some. So there's some little connection there. But he wants to experience Irish culture, and he has in his head, of course, the Celtic revival that we've talked about. So figures like Yeats and that would be important as a kind of magnetic figure in the culture. And of course, his father was a dandy. He was a bit of a dandy later on, and Oscar Wilde was another figure associated with Dublin. George Bernard Shaw. So it made a lot of sense to go there, and there's a very close connection between a lot of the American film industry at the time and Ireland. In fact, when he went in 1931 to Ireland, Robert Flaherty, who had made Nanook of the North and that great documentary, was making a film in Galway, The Men of Arran, which was a famous documentary. And he arrives and he starts painting and traveling around, and he decides to buy a donkey and cart. Apparently he's looking out a window and he sees this donkey and cart and he decides he's going to travel. There had been an Irish book called Mossel Beag Dove, My Little Black Donkey, or Donkey if you like, and some people suggest that influenced him. But it seemed he always had this a kind of gypsy element in his outlook, a kind of cosmopolitan, travelling outsider idea. So he starts travelling around the west of Ireland. So he would have travelled around where my family was and on the road by them, looking at where he probably travelled. And he's mixing with the people, seemed to have been well received from what he said, and I believe he kind of seen himself as a kind of laughing boy and said that the world loves a kind of laughing, the laughing person. And he got to know people traveling around and found it breathtaking. And although it was archaic, he appreciated that and saw something intelligent and aristocratic in the people there. And so he'd sleep under the cart or stay with farmers and try and sell his paintings. And he eventually gets to Dublin. He arrives up in Dublin. So I remember he's 16 years of age. It's quite remarkable. And he very shortly goes to the Gate Theatre, and he convinces them at the Gate Theatre that he's a successful actor in the United States. Now, they could see through it, but it wasn't untrue that he had this connection with the stage already. And there's a couple, a gay couple that ran, they're often referred to as the boys, that ran the Gate Theatre, Michael McLeamore and Hilton Edwards. So they gave him his start, age 16, and they remained friends throughout his career. And they were involved in the film Othello, for example. And they're involved in, you can see them in a documentary he makes in 1978 called Filming Othello, about the difficulties and challenges of making that film. So he did form lifelong friends. And actually, I was in communication with an actress who worked with them in Dublin on their last play recently. But he acts on the Dublin stage in a series of works and gets a great deal of experience from their expressionistic treatment of the medium. And also, Dublin has a connection with Shakespeare. There had been also this interesting movement in relation to Shakespeare and the study of Shakespeare by people like Ernest Dowden and Hester Dowden, which explored the psychological and esoteric aspect of Shakespeare. So he did also act in Macbeth there, and this connection with Shakespeare continued from his boyhood. It continued in Dublin, and he took it with him for the rest of his life. And this idea of a deeper element in Shakespeare, a deeper understanding of psychology, a deeper connection with the cosmos through Shakespeare had been explored in the 19th century. And there's books called Shakespearealism that developed that. So Ireland was very, very important. He later came back and made a short film which was nominated for an Oscar called Return to Glenaskall, which is a little ghost story which he filmed, with Hilton Edwards directed. And he would come back with Chimes at Midnight, a play based on Falstaff, which became a film which came out in 1965-66, which some people regard as a superior film as well. So he had a great connection with Ireland, and it was a very important base for him before he took off in the United States.
Going back to the point you made that you had an early interest in film, and so did I. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin in 1967, I took a course in the history of film, and I was watching a film just about every day. And the interesting thing is that One of my fellow students in that undergraduate course was a man named Joseph McBride, who was a fanatic, a real fanatic about Citizen Kane. He owned his own celluloid copy of the film. McBride was sort of very much the center of attention of this little course because of his devotion to Citizen Kane. I learned later that he actually met Wells and even played in one of Wells' movies. He played a character satirizing himself, a film critic named Mr. Pister, who was a devotee of Orson Welles. The film...
The Other Side of the Wind.
The Other Side of the Wind, exactly, which was a satire of Hollywood at the time. But subsequently, McBride wrote 2 books about Orson Welles, and I gather he's largely responsible for resurrecting Welles' reputation. That the conventional view at the time was that Welles was a tragic figure who made an early brilliant film, and his career declined ever since Citizen Kane. But McBride made a point of showing that he continued to innovate throughout the rest of his life.
That's right. He's a very respected and distinguished authority on film and on Orson Welles. And as you said, he actually became an actor in that in The Other Side of the Wind. So he really knew what he was talking about, and and I think he even appreciates Chimes at Midnight. That's where Orson Welles makes a film in Spain based on a stage play that he had done, going back to early work he had worked on, where he focuses on Falstaff as an important figure. So he took Faust and he put a laugh in it, and he gets Falstaff, I think, later on. He moves a bit from Satan to Santa, if you like. But Joseph McBride, I think, is very fair and accurate in relation to his perception of the overall trajectory of Orson Welles. And he certainly appreciates the work, the whole gestalt of the work, the total, again, symphonic element to it. And I think he's right in that. And even his work on television is underestimated. For example, he did in 1972 Future Shock, which 50 years ago is talking about the issues we're talking about in relation to technology, based on Alvin Toffler's work. So an area that's forgotten about is this interest that Orson Welles had in relation to technology, in relation to bureaucracy, in relation to over-governance, right through his life. He's a progressive politically, but he had this concern about the growth of public power. But Joseph McBride is very fair in relation to his assessment, and I agree with him. And he understands the power from Citizen Kane, which is kind of indisputable for anyone that's interested in film, and the innovation in there, the technique and the magic. But through all the other work, and through films that wouldn't be kind of popular, like he made The Trial in 1962, and he changes Kafka's book radically. But in his treatment of The Trial, there is some deep philosophical thought about the nature of society. For example, he says, or the character says, that there's a great dirty game going on which seeks to make us believe that the universe is meaningless and that it's absurd. And so he's getting engaged in a critique of essentialism and whatever through the medium of film. And this was one that was a particular example of a work that Welles had chosen himself to do, given the circumstances. So, you were lucky to meet someone. And again, it's funny as well that I think he comes from Milwaukee, so you had that interest in the Midwest. As well as another figure that's associated with that area, of course, is Harry Houdini, who Welles met and learned tricks off as part of his real interest in magic. And of course, Houdini was interested in the afterlife and in communicating. People focus on his exposure of false mediums, but that was because he really wanted to prove, he really wanted good empirical evidence of the afterlife. And the element of fakery is another element. So Wells makes this great documentary called F for Fake in 1972. And this was about the idea of fakery. So people think that fake news that is a recent phenomenon. But he's explaining about the illusory nature of the society that we're living in and the necessity for skepticism through the medium of film. So McBride understands his great interest in art. And if you study art history, and Wells had started off doing a bit of, in Chicago, studying art as well as the great experience he had at the Todd School and the great exploration. But throughout all his work, there is a reference back to the Renaissance, to the great artists, through Carpaccio and Caravaggio, up to tenebrism, chiaroscuro, different uses of light. Everywhere in his work, there's a reference to the tradition of art, and in particular to Renaissance art. So if you come from an art history background, you can understand the references as well, or you get an extra dimension, as well as understanding the technical brilliance and the versatility and the panache that he uses. So, so it's interesting that you cross paths with that, with him and with Joseph, as you were saying. And I too was very, very interested. And in London, all the art houses would play Citizen Kane and Magnificent Ambersons, and A Touch of Evil. 1958 was a film with Marlene Dietrich, and these were films that were very, very well regarded for their innovation and for their intrinsic art. And another, he was very interested in music. You mentioned that he was regarded as a genius figure. He had a very high IQ that people don't understand. He really was intelligent by any measure, if we want to measure or would believe in these things. And music was very important to him. Music was very important to his mother, and that sense of musicality informs his technique in the whole of his work. So I agree with people like Joseph McBride and his relation to his work, and that's in contrast to other views which regard him as a failure, which is quite remarkable. I think anyone that suggests that Orson Welles was a failure should put their own CV up beside his own when they're making that assessment.
Maybe it's not the precise word, but it was as if he was blacklisted by Hollywood at some point.
Well, there's two elements to it. Just again in context, he starts off, and as we said, he moved through the theatre, moves on to the radio, innovates all along, innovates in relation to context with African Americans, for example, in New York. He's interested in social issues, does his stuff with War of the Worlds, moves into film. So he was, as well as performing popular things like The Shadow on radio. It was him that was the Shadow. So he's a very popular figure, a very artistic figure. And in 1946, there was an incident that became significant, and that was associated with a man called Isaac Woodard, who was beaten horrifically by the police. And Orson Welles took up this case and read out affidavits on the radio and used the radio to challenge the police in this context. And it did achieve a trial anyway, but he focused on it. It wasn't popular. It's hard for younger people to understand the context that we're talking about in the South in 1946, is where a returning soldier was taken off a bus and ended up being blinded, and it was a horrific case. And he promoted that case, and that was important in relation to a certain element turning against him. And he became blacklisted as a communist. He was very progressive and very left-wing, but he wasn't regarded as a communist because his progressivism was based on the individual. It wasn't based on collectivity. And because he becomes blacklisted, and he was by the FBI, and that as well as that, there were other dimensions associated with the inland revenue and taxation, etc. But he decides to go to Europe in 1947, and he spends a few years in Italy. Now, Spain turns out to be his great love. I mean, he lives outside the United States for a long time. Spain is the country that he really loves, and he's drawn towards that. He always had an affection for Ireland. But in Italy, he continues his work and continues his own projects. And also, there's an important point in this. They talk about the idiosyncratic nature of his approach to film. But he was a great artist, and he was pointing to a difference in culture. For example, in France, the economic rights associated with a film are the directors, they're not the producers. So there's a different emphasis. So he wanted this freedom. He believed that the director was the critical role, and this was respected in Europe. And he engages in his projects in Italy. They may not have loved him as much as he loved historic Italy and Renaissance Italy, but he does work on one of his major projects over a few years, and that was Othello. And that was the great work which involved Michael McLeamore and Hilton Edwards. And they had been promised, or he believed he was going to get money early on, and he didn't get it. So in all of his life, he's using his own money and putting his own money back into the films. And he's striving for this independence. Now, Othello wouldn't be everyone's cup of tea, but it's a quite amazing film. And he did that documentary in the 70s where he's discussing the character. And they're engaging, as these actors do, in a deep analysis of the Shakespearean characters, of who Othello was, who Desdemona was, who Iago was. And you can see this is an important aspect in relation to the deeper elements of Shakespeare. There was this idea in the 19th century that Shakespeare opened you up to the higher worlds, and that Shakespeare was in some way connected to the esoteric domains. And I think that's quite true in relation to his conception and the psychology. So when we look at work that he did in Italy, like Othello, we see that he's engaging in deeper themes. So Iago becomes really representative of some suspicious force in society itself. Desdemona is classically the Christ-like figure. And he's showing the danger of these deep emotions. And on one point that comes true for me, and on a deeper level, again, showing the deeper elements that some people miss sometimes, that he has this critique of technology, which is there going back to 1942 and the Magnificent Ambersons, when they're considering the car and the influence of the automobile on American society and the Midwest and how it's going to change things. That's an undercurrent in the film, kind of consistent with Lewis Mumford. If you look at Othello, the film, there's a metaphor, a motif that comes through again and again, and he uses it very deliberately. It's the net, and he emphasizes this. He talks about this. The net is a critical thing, and that represents in some ways something consistent with what he showed in the trial. This notion of the human individual being caught in structures, in technological structures as well, literally the net. But there is that implication, and when you look at it in that form, it's kind of chilling. And he did other films like Black Magic, where he's playing Cagliostro, and this is a kind of interest and indicating the deeper interest he has in magic, in things like alchemy and mesmerism. And this was necessary and came from his study of magic, of illusionism, of stage magic, of performance. But he did have a deeper interest. So yes, to come back to your question, he was alienated, and he felt alienated from the power in America. And there's always this suggestion, oh well, he just wasn't nice and he was hard to work with. But he saw himself as defending art and defending the artist, and he really believed in that. That wasn't just a position. And he put his money where his mouth is, and he stood up. He had the courage of his convictions to stand up in a very hostile time for individuals. So when he's standing for Isaac Woodard, he's standing for the individual. He's not talking about everybody. He's talking about this individual and this story, which is important for him. He sees everything in terms of stories, and that's why he focused on the story of this man. And when you do, people could see the bigger issues. And it was important in the story of desegregation in the United States. So he is involved in the bigger issues because of his progressive approach.
Well, today people are developing a renewed interest in the whole question of UFOs, aliens, extraterrestrials, space travel. And it's ironic that Wells inadvertently, certainly unintentionally, had a negative impact on the study of these things, because I think it was in 1954, the government sponsored a secret commission, if I recall correctly, the Robertson panel, and they made a decision at that time that the government should begin debunking reports of UFO activity and minimizing it, because they were afraid of the fear that was engendered by Wells in his broadcast of the War of the Worlds, which apparently, because people thought that we really were being invaded by Mars, he portrayed H.G. Wells' story, The War of the Worlds, as a news report and on the radio. So people thought it was happening in real time. And as a result, the phone lines back in 1938 got tied up. And the government was afraid that if they were to reveal to the public what they knew back in the 1950s about UFOs, it would cause a panic based on what had happened in 1938.
That's interesting. What happened after 1938 was that organizations, particularly Rockefellers and that, began to fund research into the impact on media and of media in these contexts. And apparently Hitler made a comment on the decadence of the West after the 1938 broadcast. But whether their stated reason is related to that is another question, and whether there is a causal relationship between that. Orson Welles did continue to bring attention to issues like the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and he was open to all these issues, and he did work with NASA and even with NATO so he did work also with some of those big organizations, although I think he became less interested in them later on and a bit more suspicious. Whether there is a pure causal connection is a matter for debate, because of course they're going to utilize this argumentation in the context of whatever particular policy they have. There's always the danger, of course, that there's an overlap between experimental weapons that one's own government is developing and UFO experiences, and they don't want to draw attention to it. So yes, that's a matter for historians to work out.
Fortunately, it seems as if the government policy has changed finally, and the government is no longer in the business of debunking legitimate claims of UFO sightings and contacts.
Well, here we have the problem, and this is the problem that Orson Welles would suggest, and it's in F for Fake, where he says in the first hour everything I say is true, and then of course it goes over an hour and you forget that after that the promise doesn't hold. So the alternative reading of that is that the government also can utilize the policy that Orson Welles suggested in relation to this hoax nature or the accidental nature and the fooling. So whether we can be more certain or not of the phenomenon is not necessarily answered by our confidence in the government. One would hope so, and one would hope that people that have been studying these issues for a long period of time will help us to interpret and to separate the wheat from the chaff. But there's also the possibility, of course, as we've talked about before, that governments can utilize these fears for their own purposes. And that's a subtext in an obvious argument for people like George Orwell on that. So I'm not sure that he would or Orson Welles would be any more open to the government's position on that. He was quite skeptical as well. He was skeptical of psychics in certain contexts, although he did cold calling himself one time, and he said that the strange thing is that you can begin to you can pretend things, and you can say to people that, oh well, you had a cut on your knee, and or you have a cut on your knee, and everyone has a cut on their knee, etc. You can do that, or cold reading, I should say. In the cold reading context, he's skeptical, but you can still cross over into a boundary or across a boundary whereby you are actually coming up with insights. He was skeptical of mediums, but he wasn't skeptical of spirits or the possibility that there were things there. He did a program on Nostradamus, but he was skeptical about Nostradamus and the interpretations of Nostradamus. So he has, like your conversation with Ray Stanford about having a healthy balance, we have to always look at the evidence. And I think figures like him make us be careful in relation to how we assess the evidence, and I think that's a healthy approach.
Well, especially in our current era, Orson Welles was aware of misinformation and disinformation in his day. He died in 1985, but I think it's fair to say these days we are being flooded with it. So the importance of individuals to be able to sort through this morass of what are you supposed to believe is crucial today.
Yes, and that's personified by his interest in Othello and in Iago, and this figure that can make Othello murder the Christ-like figure Desdemona, and he's demonstrating how we can be manipulated, and they discuss this in the documentary about with Michael McLearmore and Hilton Edwards, what this motivation is and what is the nature of this evil, and one of them suggests that it's just in his nature, that this is a force within nature, this manipulative element that's there. So he's engaging in this examination of the shadow in this context, and he also does this through his interest in Macbeth, and he makes as well as the stage versions that he did, he makes the film in 1948, and it's very, very interesting because Macbeth is a very dark play, and the actors refer to it as the Scottish play. They don't use the term in many senses, and it's a very dark film, a very interesting film. And he had an addition to that, which is very interesting, which Shakespeare didn't have into it. And he said not many people noticed this. He puts a holy man who says a prayer to Saint Michael and the prayer against evil. So this is a quite interesting, the kind of exorcist prayer in the center of the film, because he did believe that these forces were real. And in all these, he took evil very seriously. So consistent with the Shakespearean context, in many senses, they're seeing the humans as puppets in a kind of cosmic battle. And these elements they're not going to go away. There's always going to be a Iago force in society, which will create suspicion, which will create this doubt, which will manipulate people, which will manipulate otherwise honorable people, and will lead to the destruction of innocence. And in Macbeth, he's portraying those forces again in a very dark way, although he seeks to balance it with, I think, that the holy man figure, which is quite interesting. So what they're doing by examining these themes over and over again, Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, King Lear, Falstaff, is saying, well, there's something in this work, something classical about the nature of the human psyche, which will always manifest itself from us internally as an individual, from us socially, and at a macro level, and that we must understand these. And that's why he goes on later to celebrate the kind of the comic figure, in a way, of Falstaff, who is a very larger-than-life figure, who in some ways, as he may have been Yankee Doodle Dandly, he transforms himself into a Falstaffian figure. And Falstaff was a kind of hero for Wells. Now, he's not an obvious hero in the Shakespearean plays, but he takes Falstaff from different plays of Shakespeare and puts them together in a composite. And he admires Falstaff because Falstaff is not taken in by this talk about gaining honor through war and violence or power. And he's associated with Merry England, and this is a kind of a theme through the work of Oscar Wilde about the lost paradise that's there, kind of looking back to tradition and a kind of nostalgia. But it's a deeper argument in Wells. He's saying that we're losing something, and this movement in the technological society, we're moving away from a kind of human scale interaction. And Falstaff becomes a positive figure for him, because Falstaff wants to enjoy himself and have a merry life, and he's not interested in this power, in this ruthless pursuit of power that King Hal is. You notice Hal is the same name that he used for the computer in 2001: A Space Odyssey, although that HAL 2000 is based on the initials IBM, the HI, AB and LM. So there's another interesting connection there. But he doesn't like this concentration of power. He doesn't like this pursuance of power, and he's happy to make Falstaff an unlikely hero by indicating that there's a nobility to not wanting power. And in many senses, although he may have been pursued by powerful forces in the United States and was now rejected, that same thing happened to Falstaff in relation to King Henry, that he's saying, well, my love is for the people, for my fellow human beings, irrespective of race, irrespective of other differences. That he emphasizes this cosmopolitan aspect, the human aspect, again and again, whether in the story, and that's why he says you have to understand these forces. You have to understand how jealousy works, why jealousy works, for example, in relation to Othello. You have to understand what this pursuit of power, how deadly it can become, like in Macbeth. So these are recurrent things. They don't go away. And these are patterns that come true in contemporary politics, in contemporary societies. It's the same thing, these emotions. So he's asking us to look at those base emotions, to take them seriously, to look at the Faustian figure, to look at these dark figures and to understand them, because he did certainly see the West as going through a Faustian phase. And that's the importance of looking at those human psychological and psychic elements.
I gather that the screenplay for Citizen Kane did win. The screenplay he wrote, co-authored with Mankiewicz, as I recall, at the age of 25, won the screenplay for Best Picture. And the reason is not because of, the wonderful cinematic techniques of the film, but the screenplay itself dealt with human emotions. It dealt with love and power seeking and jealousy and these various issues were part of his mastery. Maybe the greatest part of his genius was his ability to see into the human heart. Yes,
and in particular, he had this element in himself. So in many senses, when he starts off with the idea of Lucifer and bright Lucifer, he's exploring Luciferian elements in himself, and he's drawn towards the dark characters. And what he sees, and one motif that I think is important in relation to the magical element, is that I believe that an important aspect of his technique is an understanding of alchemy in a spiritual context. So if you look at, you've talked about Mercury theatre. Mercury is a symbol of alchemy. The mirror is a motif which comes up in alchemy. We have the mirror of alchemy, 1597. He's fascinated with the moon. The moon is very important in alchemy and in relation to Hermeticism. And if you look at the filming of The Trial, for example, he said he was looking out the window and he saw 2 moons. And it turns out that the second moon was a clock face on the train station. And he went to the train station and he used that in the film. And he says, I'm not going to explain why the moon is important to me. So he gives these little clues sometimes. And I believe it's because he understood alchemy in a deep sense and applied it. So he takes the mercurial element, the quicksilver element, which is in himself, and you can see it in the technique, in the filmography that he uses, in the style of Citizen Kane and Magnificent Ambersons. He uses this quicksilver technique, dark, shadow, tenebrism, light, changing, the camera moving, the camera moving through walls, through glass in a kind of magic spiritual way. He takes the mercury element, sometimes seen as a feminine element, and a watery element, watery metallic element, and he brings in a sulfurous counterpoint. Again, like a musical fugue with 2 themes, the individual and something outside him. And the sulfurous element is usually represented by a kind of fiery figure, a Faustian figure, a Citizen Kane figure, a figure which is dark. He was very interested in the heart of darkness. He was trying to get Kurtz off the ground. The film that I suppose was a precursor of Apocalypse Now later on in one of its versions. But he tries to represent these sulfurous figures, and he brings them together in a triangle, because the salt is the crystalline form which balances them. There's a triangle throughout his life, whether with his father and his guardian, Dr. Bernstein, or with Hilton Edwards and Michael McLeamore. It's a sense that he uses this as a structure of artistic technique. And what he's saying is that in the human psyche, there are all these forces that we have to understand. We have to understand the mercurial and the sulfurous in order to get the balance with the salt. And this is an idea that goes back to Jacob Boehme and came through the Corpus Hermeticum and the Emerald Tablets. He had a deeper knowledge. I think this is an area which has been underexplored in relation to the idea of his magic. People focus on the stage magic, the stage shows he did during the Second World War to entertain the troops, cutting Rita Hayworth in half and all that, and later on his magic shows. But there's a deeper philosophical element which explains his technique and explains his understanding. So it's a deep understanding of what would make these characters work, what was so compelling. And in looking at that, he is demonstrating forces which operate on a higher level. He's indicating that if we don't really understand how to balance these forces, we're never going to be able to manage ourselves socially. He was very, very interested in also world organization at a particular time, worryingly so from my perspective. But I think he changed when he began to meet some of these leaders from South America and that. He began to understand that the corporate influence on countries would make this global governance something different. And I think he got a bit colder on that. But yes, what he's saying is, and going back to Citizen Kane, is that there's a deep motivation. These figures represent something in us. The pursuit of materialism, of power, ultimately is futile, that you end up empty-handed in it. And there are deeper things. Although he was progressive and he didn't like Steiner, he wasn't fond of agnostics, but he wasn't really atheistic. He often stresses faith as being important, although he doesn't express a particular faith himself. But he's saying that we have to be attached to something beyond ourselves. And art for him is something which is beyond ourselves. And that's why, although he wasn't a Christian in a standard sense. When he's taken the example of the great work of art, he refers to Chartres Cathedral in F for Fake as the great example of human art, and explains that we don't know who the authors of that was. It was a collaborative work, like a film, I suppose. But he's again and again saying that we have to look and concentrate and think and reflect on emotions, our weaknesses, and our ability to be manipulated. And that's why he has this endless fascination. And also from a psychological perspective, he has deep insights in relation to the nature of reality and human interaction with that.
Well, I think the connection between Orson Welles and the Hermetic tradition is a very original idea that you've come up with. I haven't seen that elsewhere. And in a way, it makes sense because the Mercury Theater, which he co-founded, Mercury is simply the Roman name for the Greek god Hermes, who was associated with the Hermetic tradition. That's an important clue right there.
He often gives other explanations. He gives another alternative or explanation for why he used the word Mercury, or why they use it with Houseman. But he's not always being upfront about that, because great magicians don't reveal their secret approaches, and great directors on that often have some simple formulae that help them to control the totality of situations around them. And you see that, for example, in relation to ingredients in a film, once he found the people that were good, he was very loyal to them, to the actors or actresses. He used them again and again because he'd know how the ingredients can work. And interestingly, in relation to the language he used in relation to films, he said every film was an experiment. And I think that's very interesting. People gloss over that. He said every film was an experiment, and that experiment is a kind of alchemical idea, well, getting the different forces together. And even if you look at when they're talking about the cinematic technique, and there's a lot of dissolves, for example. Well, the idea of dissolving is another alchemical idea, so I believe that he took deeper ideas and had them in his head in relation to the arrangement. And so when we're thinking about the magic, we have to think about his interest in illusionism, and mentalism as well as another thing that he was interested in, the ordinary work of people that work in that domain. And that was the context of why he's interested in cold reading and why he's interested in mesmerism and that. But I do think that when you look at the clues, the little snippets that aren't followed up, like when he mentions the moon, when he's talking to Peter Bogdanovich, that there's that, you're saying, well, why is he interested in the moon? The moon, in some of these senses, represents the mother as well. So you say, well, if he saw the moon and that led him, why did he go down and why did he see the moon as such a significant pointer? And it may be that he associated the moon, for example, with literally with his mother, or with that element, and believed that it was a sign. And this is the way that Jacob Boehme sees the world in relation to signs. So there is a kind of superstitious element in relation to things that he pursues. He's always an explorer. In his life, in his work, he does. The idea of exploration is very, very important. He travelled with his father around the world when he was a boy, and his father was an alcoholic. He was looking after him more than the other way around. But he also made these kind of travel documentaries. He did them in Spain, for example, one in the Basque country in the 50s. And we have this exploration idea as well, this investigation of the unknown. And again, through all that, there is a kind of overriding zeal to know something. But he wanted to know something, but in his effort to know things, to get to the bottom of these volatile emotions, again, which is an alchemical idea in many senses, that he is pursuing via a higher technique. People ignore how intelligent the man was, how well read he was, how he would have read things that were interested in him, how magicians read around things associated with magic. He was fascinated with the medieval era. He was fascinated with the Renaissance era. He was very familiar with all the artistic context. He was very familiar with Italy. So he would have been familiar in particular with the Hermetic knowledge as it came through Italy, that people like Francis Yates has written about that era. He would have been very familiar. And he goes to Spain, and he loves Spain. And he wants to be buried there, and his ashes were spread there. And he lived in Ronda, in Andalusia, and he loved Seville. And these are also places associated with magic in the Middle Ages and Kabbalah. So I don't think that's an accidental connection. I don't see necessarily much there. But when you're talking about Seville and Segovia and Toledo, you're talking about the crucibles of connection between Judaism, Jewish magic, Arabic magic, and Christian magic, and the interaction in a triangular system in those cities. So I think there is an extra element in the history of those contexts that would have informed him. He became very engrossed in the European context, in the European art context. And because of his interest in magic, he couldn't have been unaware of these things. And when we look for the clues, I think there is still a little story to be gained. Now, there's so many people who have written about Orson Welles at this stage. I'm sure some will say, oh, there's there is a book or somewhere, but I haven't seen it yet. But there's a lot to be explored. And I think, as well as that, people are going to have to pay attention a bit more to what he was saying about the nature of technology, the nature of bureaucracy, the nature, for example, sometimes in the United States they forget about the work that he did over in Europe. And he did his first appearance in the 50s, I think, in Britain. They asked him what would he spend money on if he had, unlimited amount of money. And what he said was quite remarkable at the stage, if we think about how long ago it was. He said he would get all the best constitutional lawyers together to begin to work against the defeat of civil liberties that is happening through the encroachment on the liberty of the individual. And that was a remarkable foresight. That was a deeply held belief that he had, a view that I respect about protecting the individual. So what I think we have to think about is that maybe with some of these figures, because their worldview is so big, that we think we see it and we don't see it. We think we understand it and we don't see it. And when we're laughing at him sometimes, the joke is on us, because he's controlling what's happening. He's getting paid for these things, and he's a mastery of all those performance media. He knows what fakery is, but he's not so sure that we know what those things are or can distinguish between reality and illusion. So I think there, despite the great scholarship that has been done on him, there are some themes in the overall symphony of his life that are relevant, and that he is in that context of that meta-narrative that was sought to argue about a conflict between the individual and bureaucracy or industrialization, and it's there throughout his work.
Well, James Tunney, once again, a very stimulating conversation. And I know we could keep talking about Orson Welles for a long time during the discussion. There are many, many little points I'd want to follow up on, but I think this is a very good overview of the key elements of his life. So are there any thoughts you'd like to say in conclusion?
The last point that I would emphasize is, and why I have a lot of respect for him, is that when he set out on his journey to Ireland, age 16, engaging with the people, he's demonstrating a lifelong interest in the individual. And in that, what's very important to him is the story. He is a storyteller. This is a thing that was respected in Ireland. One of the reasons he would have been attracted to Ireland. And everything is about the story. He was always interested in the story. And the reason is because the story is critical to our lives, and it's something that we tell each other, and it's something about how we explain the world to each other, and something about how we understand each other. And some of the great films that he didn't make, he worked on Don Quixote. He didn't do The Heart of Darkness, or he didn't finish it. But the most interesting thing that he didn't do, in my view, was, surprisingly, his Life of Christ. He wanted to do it, which would, in many senses, be the greatest story. He wanted to set it in a modern context. He communicated with Christian leaders of all denominations, and he was very serious about this. And that could have been very, very interesting. But in all these situations, the same as his interest in particular individuals that were discriminated against or suffered abuse from different races, it didn't matter. He focused on the story. He focused on the individual experience. He cut away from general identities. He focused on the individual behind the story. So there's an individual telling story, and there's an individual who gives the story. And because of his kind of Merlin-esque approach, again consistent with C.S. Lewis and those people that followed in the critique of this figure that appears to us, he's saying that we really have to listen to each other's story. We have to be open to different stories, strange stories, stories that are of different things, that the world is a lot stranger than we know, and as was mentioned in Hamlet. So what I like about him is that humanity, and he saw the threats to that humanity from an over-technologicalization of society. So I have great respect for him for that, and I think that there is interest in scholarship that yet to be done on those themes, that he gets credit, and that we listen to him, because some of these figures are too big to put in a little compartment, and they're certainly not figures to be dismissed, and not figures to be regarded as failures in any sense. It's a failure of our own imagination if we can't see that he was a great artist that contributed to our life and sought to warn us about some of the forces in our own personality that can manifest on a higher level. So thank you very much once again, Jeff, for that. Thank you.
Well, thank you for an amazing contribution, our 41st interview, and each time we speak, James, I'm just awed by the depth of your knowledge, and even more so the depth of your insights. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us. It's because of the viewers and the listeners that we're here. The inaugural issue of the New Thinking Aloud magazine was just released on March 1st. You can download a free PDF copy from the New Thinking Aloud Foundation website